I come from a small village of 250 people. They're all my cousins. They all have the same last name as I do. We grew up together, we eat together, share, together, do, celebrate things together, whether there's, a wedding or maybe even, a funeral. All of those things happen as a community. Even going through war makes it a lot easier to recover because you have a community to support there for you. It was just, after coming to America when I realized that there was such a thing as a counselor, a mental counselor. I never had to go through that. I never had to look for one because my counselors were my family members. Grandma, grandpa, and uncles, and just aunts and parents. So when you have a community, you pretty much have everything there, financial, emotional, psychological, all of these things that come together so that we take for granted. I never had to think about those until I came here and realized I don't have any of it after moving here. Obviously there is a community, doesn't happen in a vacuum. There has to be someone or something that holds it together. And education is a perfect place for that. You start with those ideas that you want to share and you care about. And then others will come and just, join it as long as there is something for them and they're interested in this. And that's how it starts, I believe, because we're all finding something in common and somebody has to share those things, right? If no one shares them, there is no community. There is nothing that holds that sense of belonging there. Because I live here, but then when I try to compare this, this society with other places, when it comes to the question of community, we don't have a lot of community here. So my question to them is like, well, what can we do to bring community? Kind of like re-energize our own, society with community, because that's a piece that is essential for us as human beings. For me, community obviously doesn't mean Albanian community, because I am an Albanian. Community is anyone that I can connect with on a personal level, share something together. It could be a tradition, could be faith, could be shared interests and all of that. So Beaverton, I lived there for a while, so I have a community of friends and supporters, and we still, go and visit each other. But they're not from one place, they're from all over the world. So I enjoy that. It doesn't have to be my own community, meaning the Albanian or the community from Kosovo. Anyone can be my community. Well, I think just realizing that at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and our national ethnic identities are all social creations. We made them up for a reason. They worked for a while maybe, not anymore. They're only dividing us. So I think just realizing that we all come from one source. We all came from one place. We're all family at the end of the day. Those ethnic, and nationalist lines of division, they're not doing us any good. And I feel like once we're able to push that aside and realize that you and I are not very different from each other, there's so many more reasons for us to get together and work together and then argue about meaningless things. Essentially, that's how nationalism works. We argue about things that we had nothing to do with. Of course, I was not exposed to a lot of information when I was back in Kosovo, so coming here and being immersed into a new world essentially. And I said, well, I want to do something with this, not just keep it to myself. So what I did was, share my own experiences, start from me, right? Change starts from within. Where do I find peace? I think peace, we do not have to go to a place. I believe it's everywhere. You just have to be mindful and look for it. Because once you look for it, you will find it. That's what I believe. That could be obviously out in nature, or could be just reading something beautiful, inspiring, or listening to another person speak and share a story, or read their story. But also it happens, when during my meditation or prayer times, or just exchanging knowledge with people and learning from them, that is inspiring to me. That gives me that peace of mind that I'm not alone in here. We're all in this together, and if we're going to survive as human beings, we have to work together. And working for peace, I think it's one of the most noble of causes, because people who do not work for peace, obviously you see war, and that's what we saw in the Balkans. People were not busy talking about peace. They were busy talking about the other side, how evil the other side is, and how they're out there to get you, which was not the case really. This was a war created, it was a war of ideas essentially, and it turned into violence. Peace can come from anywhere really. We just have to be mindfully looking for it. When it comes to internal peace, community, definitely those collectivist societies are more inclined, as far as like achieving internal peace, because there's just so much happening. There's so much support, so much understanding happening. Individual societies, we're just most of the time we're alone, right? And we tend to reflect on ourselves and really forget about other people, and that can create barriers. Someone said the most dangerous thing we can do in America is talk to our neighbors, and I see that. And obviously the author is joking about that, but that's what happens. We just tend to close our doors because we want to enjoy our own peace, but what we're doing is we're closing the door to that internal peace as well. Because for me, there is peace when there are people coming together. If there is no inner peace, there is no outer peace. Many people tend to take a class or two on peace studies and assume that they're ready to make peace. If we do not have it, we're not going to be able to resonate that peace with the outside world. So for me, of course, how do I gain that peace? How do people do that? There's so many ways, right? Different things work for different people, but wherever you find that sense of flow, like what makes you content with your life, with the things around you. I have that peace, for instance, and I join a crowd and I share that and I speak that, not just on paper, but I live it. I want to be able to, when I come in contact with somebody, to know that I am a person who's working on himself and wants to expand that circle. I was a second grader. I went to school one day, and this was a school shared by both Albanians and Serbs and other ethnic groups. But this September day, as a second grader, our school was filled with soldiers who told us, "This is not your school anymore, go back, you do not belong here." Those were the words, and those are very hard for me, and of course that happened to all of the other kids, but I didn't understand what that meant. Like, what is the difference between me and a Serbian or that other student? I was only 7, of course, so I didn't know that. So I went home crying, and because my passion in life was, and it still is, to go to school, get an education. I went home crying and tell my parents this what happened. They said, "Well, this happened all over the country. It's not just your school." So from that time on, of course, that sense of hatred started to grow. It's the other side, right? It's their fault. They took our school. They're taking our all the people who were Albanians who were working were being fired only because they were Albanian. And then you would see, killings here and there. So there was that idea that always there was going to be something bigger coming. We just didn't know how. And then one day the soldiers come into our own village and demand that we give them everything we had, our money and the gold and that people had. And also they asked that we give them the gas from our cars, from our from the tanks. We did that. But my father and a few other people saved some. And as soon as they left, my father said, "Jump in the car and we're all going to leave this place." This was our village where, we had been there for at least 300 years in Suhadol, the village where I grew up. So we jumped into our car, and on our way to this other village, there was a Serbian checkpoint, a bunch of soldiers there hanging out and just waiting for someone to pass by and shoot them, intimidate them, all of those things, which was very common. We were terrified, of course, and here we see at a distance this soldier notices this civilian car coming, which was unusual because there were no civilian cars, there was only military passing through. The soldier takes his gun, walks in the middle of the road, and he points it at us, like, you come closer, I'm shooting you. And my dad tells us, we're not going to stop, we're just going to drive through here. No matter what happens, we're not going to wait. We're not going to stay. They're going to kill us anyway. So as we get, close enough, this man is getting ready to shoot. We hear this other voice, and our windows roll down. That this other voice on the sidewalk says, "Hey, Skender, Skender." There's this other soldier called my father's name, and as soon as he did that, the soldier on the street with the gun, he's confused, lowers his gun, and just walks away. He did not know, obviously, who we were, but this other, soldier had known my father from previous interactions. And then we just passed through and went through the city. Not a lot of people were in the city, but those who were just pillaging the stores around and the houses and burning them down. It was a war zone, of course. No one imagined that we could have survived that. The day after we moved, it was like a dream. Like, no one could believe that this was happening all at once. So what I did was I saw this wall there, and there was a ladder, and started climbing up, and I started looking toward the direction of our village, and all I could see was fire coming out, and I knew that this was our homes being set on fire, but I didn't want to believe it. And this was the first time in my life that I really wanted to turn into a bird or something, so I could fly there and just see what was happening. And people say, well, that was your house, and because there were also cousins there who couldn't escape. But one thing for me that I really kept me thinking was my dog. We left our dog. We had to leave our dog there. We couldn't take him with us, and he was there, and so he, essentially at the end he survived. But I really struggled with that, just knowing that I had still people there, I had cousins there, and we had left everything behind. That was the only time when I said, I wish I could turn into a bird and fly and just see what was happening. As soon as we lost our school and we could no longer share a school with Serbian children, we created our own schools. And again, this was all illegal, done by teachers and administrators who were essentially jobless and we're talking about the period of 1991, 92. It was 92 when I lost my school, so all those people had to go somewhere. So what we did was we found abandoned homes, buildings, all kinds of structures that could hold a group of people together. So I remember when I first started, there was no building. All of them were taken, and these buildings most of the time were buildings of people who had left the country because of the pressures by the regime, right? So sometimes they let us use their houses, and it was the education that was happening while the Serbian government was continuing with the program of ethnic cleansing. Even though all of things were happening, the Serbs were continuing their own education in their own schools, official Albanians in their own settings, which was, again, illegal. If you were caught, you would be punished by the police or just civilians for you getting an education. That was considered a crime, because at this time, of course, Albanians were not allowed to go to school. So I remember doing that for about 7 years, I believe. And of course, that could also, sometimes it meant that our house turned into a school. Certain families would host the teacher and the students, and then the next week would be a different house. That way the police or the soldiers would not be able to track us where we were. Other times would be across, across town. So we would take the railroad instead of the main street because we were afraid that we would get caught and get beat up, or just have people send us back home forcefully. And many times that did happen. Usually Serbian civilians would block the road and throw rocks at us and make us cry and force us to go back home and not continue the education, because people knew that. They saw us every day going somewhere. So you couldn't avoid that. But at some point, the Serbian government turned a blind eye on us and let them do their own thing. They're not interacting with our students. It was hard because there were no conditions for education to take place. Sometimes there were just desks made of all kinds of things. Really, there was nothing there. These were just empty spaces, no electricity sometimes no roof at all. So we were out in the open trying to continue with our education. We got books a lot of the times from Albania, people illegally brought them into the country and would sell them to us for a fairly reasonable price so we could continue our education. As hard as that was, I was grateful that I could go to school, because that was a dream of mine. I want to finish my education and I want to do something with my life for myself and my family. After we stayed in Switzerland for a while and found our friends and our place, and we kind of began to establish ourselves. As soon as the Swiss government announced that they would be able to sponsor us to go back home, my parents discussed about this and they said, we want to go home. Obviously there was nothing left of home by this time because everything was burned down. They said, well, we have family, we have community again. Our land is there. So Switzerland was beautiful and everything was amazing, but at the end of the day, there's nothing like home, and that's what made us go back and start our lives. As hard as it was to leave Switzerland, because we were getting used to the way of living and looking for jobs and all that, none of that happened, because as soon as the government announced that they would sponsor us to go back, we did that. When we returned home, there wasn't much, and the first people that we saw was my grandparents, who had returned to Kosovo right after the war because they had stayed in a different camp in Macedonia. And then, of course, when it comes to our house, nothing was left except for the structure. But my cousins had also returned at the same time, so that was very rewarding to see everybody, but also my dog, who had survived the war, because he was there the whole time with no food or water, but just hiding in places. All the other animals had been killed. He was the only one who had survived that whole thing. But of course, he was pretty traumatized at the end. After the war, as far as the relationships go, there wasn't much that happened. Most Albanians would want nothing to do with their Serbian neighbors, who previously had been good neighbors and had good relationships and bought and sold from each other. This was all just normal everyday life. The war and nationalism destroyed all of that. And it took a while to repair those relationships, and to this day, not every relationship is repaired for obvious reasons. Some people lost, family members, and so on. So it's not that easy to, to push that aside. That's not something that happens. That takes years or even generations. Most of my poems have a narrative aspect to it because. Of course, that's how I grew up. I grew up with stories. So when I started writing poetry, it was very natural for me to continue in that fashion. So there was every page, every poem has a story to it, something that has to do with home or with family or community or war, as is the case with my first book. Most of that is about the struggles that my family and I experienced, and the only way I could relate that and maybe even code those messages was through poetry. People who knew the context would understand what I was talking about. People who did not know the context may not understand, and that was because obviously if the Serbian regime, caught those poems and me talking about my pride as someone who wanted to do things for his country, that would be controversial, and I'm not sure what would happen. So I tried to code a lot of those messages. And of course, when you translate them into English, a lot of that is lost as well. So I would do a poetry reading here, and people say, well, can you give us the background story? So every poetry, which is a page, probably has about 5 pages of background story, at least the way I see it. The alchemy of mind, as soon as I got to Oregon, when I was going to school at Rogue Community College, because I took some classes and I was gaining so much, obviously knowledge and experience from just the people around me, because again, America was something new to me. I had never imagined that I would be here and going to school, so just being exposed to so much was enriching for me. So I wanted to put a lot of that knowledge and my own experiences into poems, and that's why it's named The Alchemy of Mind, how the mind processes a lot of that knowledge and life experiences into a body of light that I call in one of my poems. Because at the end of the day, every experience that we have, every exchange that we have is light for people to take from. And maybe for me it has changed my life. Being here, going to school, getting a quality education, it has made me who I am. So that's why I like to encourage other people to continue their education and do things with that knowledge, and just not keep them to themselves. And that's what I love to do. I like to share that.